The art of self-reliance is forging your own path, but the path is difficult. Made easier by learning from those who have succeeded in directing their own lives on their own terms. With their help and inspiration, your path to self-reliance moves from dream to reality. And now, here's your host, Dr. Rodney King.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Art of Self-Reliance podcast. In this episode, I speak to retired U.S. Army Special Forces operator J.D. Morris. J.D. spent 13 years on operational detachments in 3rd Battalion and 5th Special Forces Group. Over those 13 years, he served as the Engineer Sergeant, Intelligence Sergeant, and Operational Sergeant on Special Forces A teams. He deployed 5 times under long-term combat conditions from 1991 to 2006. In addition, he was also deployed in numerous contingency operations in the Middle East during the 90s. After his 3rd tour in Iraq during the global war on terror in 2006, he found himself sick and confused. He was suffering from PTSD and TBI, but he couldn't recognize it in himself. After a medical retirement in 2008 and after 21 years of service, he was lost in life after the military. It would take 6 more difficult years before the healing started. JD is transparent about this part of his life in an attempt to give back and help others with the same post-military and combat injuries. As such, he offers the same support to local law enforcement and first responders. In this episode, we discuss countering depression, how nutrition aids in mental and emotional clarity, and longevity.
The art of self-reliance calls you to adventure, to develop your self-protection skills, to learn how to survive no matter where you find yourself, and to thrive amongst life's chaos.
JD, here's my first question for you. When you hear the words self-reliance, what does that mean to you?
It's taken a different meaning over time. I would say growing up, I don't know. I don't know if I fully remember, but after the military, it was mostly relying on the military mindset, the skills I had been given, and just being hard. And I always use the analogy of just trying to, run through the brick wall. Maybe in special forces, get around it. But then in the last 12 years since retirement, it's meant so much more. 6 or 7 of those, it was in a pretty dark space. But, now self-reliance is, I guess if I embrace the 4 states of being: mental, emotional, physical, spiritual, it's just not about the physical and the tough-mindedness. It's embracing the other 2 and putting them all together.
One of the things we said we would talk about, and obviously, you need to just, and I want to respect where you're coming from. So only feel free to share what you feel you can, of course. But definitely one of the things that I'm sure we're both aware of in different respects, and we might be coming from it from different points of view. You coming out of the military, maybe the experiences that I had growing up. Depression has been something that I've had to deal with personally. I know that you've had to deal with that. It isn't uncommon for veterans to be dealing with a lot of depression and issues coming out of the service, depending on the experiences they had, of course, right? But maybe you can talk a little bit about, where you were at and where you are now.
No, well, thank you so much for what you do. And again, maybe up to the military, up till retirement in 2008, I may have been single-minded, only thinking about any, pluses or minuses in a military environment. But now has so much more compassion and empathy for everyone. PTSD, I don't believe it has to be one event. Depression, I think it might have been genetic in my family. So, the past couple of years really have made progress with it. We'll say one of the hardest things for me to do, whether it was in the dark place or coming out of it, was for me to recognize it myself and admit it and accept it. I kept thinking that, I was a bad person and this shouldn't happen. Well, whether to the military guy or to the value-driven, person I thought I was outside the military, I'm like, this just can't be happening. I didn't accept it as a medical diagnosis. And until I did that, I didn't make much progress.
Yeah, so that's interesting that you say that, right? The whole idea of acceptance. So obviously this this podcast is about you and not me, but just a quick share. A lot of people that know my background know where I came from. I was, brought up on the south side of Johannesburg. It's like government housing. I had an abusive alcoholic mother. I had to deal with bullies. Anyway, long story short, right? My childhood wasn't a good childhood, and there was a lot of trauma there. And then I got into the martial arts, and that's where I've spent most of my time. But in the years that I've been doing it, I've taken an enormous amount of punishment to my body, right? So my neck is completely messed now, to the point that the neurosurgeon said, listen, you need to do something else, find something else to do. But the main thing for me is about several years ago, I really started going down a slippery slope, and I started going into this massive depression, and I've written about it on my blog. And exactly as you said, the thing that I found the hardest was really accepting that there was a problem, because I kept thinking that how can somebody like me and what I've achieved, why can't I get my shit together? Like, why can't I turn this around? And I wouldn't acknowledge it because I saw it as a weakness, right? It's like, just if I'm just a little bit more mentally stronger, I should be able to get out of this. Was that kind of your experience too?
Brother, you're spot on. And I still have trouble with that today. That's why I use that analogy about running through the brick wall. Because in special forces after the Gulf War, we're said to be, trained unconventional warriors, think outside the box. But in this case, with the mental and emotional, all I, figuratively kept trying to do was run through the wall. It was like, look, I'm all these, combat tours, and I'm all these qualifications and high speed training in the military. What's wrong with me outside of this? Why can't I? Okay, well, tomorrow we'll fix it. And going back to your point, I'm very transparent about all of this. So, the depression and any of the diagnosis goes with substance abuse. And that would always be my go-to. And then I would, that insanity of thinking, well, I get up tomorrow morning, I get to go jump out of a plane, go shoot while I was in the military. Outside 12 years ago, I would try to replicate that in some way, mostly through training or training others. And I would say, well, things are going to be different today. I'm going to feel differently. I'm going to, something's going to change. I'm not going to be sleeping out of my truck anymore. And obviously that didn't happen. So, the full, obviously getting the substances out. But then, actually 2 years after that, that was 2013, 2015, I had a lot of suicidal thoughts, and I'm like, I'm working my butt off. There's no more, what I think, or the doctors say is poison. What's going on? Well, I still hadn't dealt with that, the rucksack that was on my back, or the, black gorilla deep down inside there. And, it took another year. When I started truly working on that, that's when the progress started, like 2016. But yeah, I'm a perfectionist. I'm over controlling, on and on and on. Those are VA diagnoses. But, when I looked at those on paper and I realized them and I accepted them, that's when I, could start. And that's when the self-reliance, when I fully saw that for myself, it's like, okay, this is a starting point.
So let's talk a little bit about that, because I think that's really important. There are a lot of people that are going to be listening to this that are possibly dealing with the same things we're talking about. What did you do to start turning it around? And I think maybe you can speak to this as well. And I want to make this very clear, is that it's not like it's a magic bullet, right? A magic pill that suddenly you do A, B, C, and everything just falls back into alignment and everything's great again. In actual fact, it's something that has to constantly be worked on. You have good days and you have bad days. But I would say, like, even for myself right now, I have a lot more, good days than I have bad days. But it's still a work in progress. But I'm interested to know what kind of strategies, things that you did that you felt that really helped you.
I believe I had, I still had a good bit of, mental and physical self-resilience, self-reliant, ways to go about it. But from those post-retirement 6 or 7 really dark years, and then a couple years even without the booze and pills, I could finally see that it just wasn't truly working. So I'm like, you know what, I'm going to give the formal medical process, more chances. when I walked back in, and for me, from the start, it was the individual therapy, finding someone, whether it was inside the VA or out, that I could fully trust, which it doesn't always happen. You might have to go through a couple providers, and sit down and have them, I guess, dissect me, and also, for once in my life, truly be honest with myself about the darkness, some of it prior to the military growing up, and abuse, tried college for a couple years, drinking too much, the military, trauma, on everything that I thought. And I had built up a lot of shame. That was also key. That was like so, we talk about the depression and things that I may have not accepted. I accepted that, but then the shame kind of hit me from the periphery, a total blind side. And I didn't understand it. And most people say, well, you're pretty well put together, pretty smart guy. And I'm like, brother, I don't even know the difference between shame and guilt. So they explained it to me again. Might have been a counselor, therapist. And I'm like, holy crap, that's me. I some things to feel guilty about, but I had no clue about this dark cloud of shame. And when we started to work on that in 2016, I mean, it was just, it was, it felt like, getting that bad stuff out of your system, the poison, eating right, all this. It was just like, wow, something feels better. And the rest of 2016, I came back from a VA treatment, and one of the best along the East Coast for PTSD, TBI, and substance abuse. And then some of the other things that I had done, whether it be working out, I wasn't eating right, I wasn't drinking anymore, but some value-driven family stuff and personal stuff, started to kick in again. Where I was doing that in the past, but it wasn't having any, I'd either half-assed it, or it wasn't doing it because it was still a mental and emotional thing. And then I just kept moving forward. And of course, I had to go back and address that stuff that was on paper from the one therapist, at the VA. I went down that list, and it's like, well, perfectionism. Yes, I'm trying to make the perfect workout schedule, the perfect diet every day, and it wasn't really killing me like before. I could look back and see how that did over my Army career, but now it's like, okay, well, if I don't get this in today, if I have some chips and M&Ms, that's okay, but let's just try to keep going forward. And 3-4 years later, and at some point in those 3-4 years, I said, hey, this is a process, this is a marathon. I guess I always wanted to sprint before, and I'm on an antidepressant. I'm on Lexapro, and the rest are either on the physical side, blood pressure, high cholesterol. Because at one point I went anti-medicine. I don't I don't know how you feel about that, but don't go cold turkey like I did several times. Yeah, the individual therapy and listening. My wife is big on listening to your body. I'm 56 now, and I still want to go out and be Batman, but that doesn't work out well.
So I find it really interesting where you talk about this idea of shame. So again, just because we're sharing, and I think it's important for other people to hear this, where my problem came in, and I want to hear your thoughts on this. So this was my issue that I found, was I had a lot of trauma when I was a child. I didn't deal with it. I kind of put it in the background. Like you said, just running through the wall, right? Just running through that brick wall, one brick wall after the next. It's kind of what I did. And I put myself out there. And for a lot of years, I mean, I would just fight anybody and everything, right? And when I was teaching around the world, if anybody wanted to step up and touch gloves with me and spar, I would do it, right? And so I ended up taking an enormous amount of trauma to my head. And that ultimately became the trigger that put me into depression. But I didn't realize it at the time. I didn't know that, right? So for a long time there, I was just having huge problems with anxiety, with aggression, with mood swings all over the place. And I had no idea what was happening. And then I blew out my neck, which was coming already. And it forced me to take a step back. And for months, I couldn't do anything. And what I noticed over those several months of not being able to get on the mat and train and not actually spar like I used to, I was actually feeling better. I mean, I wouldn't say I was 100%, but I was definitely feeling better. And then once I was healed, I put myself back on that treadmill, right? And I'm back again and I'm slamming those walls. And literally within a short period of time, I'm feeling all of that stuff come back. So long story short, eventually, as you did, I went and saw professionals. I went and saw therapists and went for, to find out what is actually going on. So it could be diagnosed. And the long story is, the short story of the long story is ultimately what it came down to is I've obviously done a lot of damage to my brain with all the impact that I've taken over the years. And the consensus was one, medication, which was I found interesting because my psychiatrist said, until you take medication and you get what's going on chemically in your head right, you're never going to be able to deal with it in the way that you want to mentally and fix this thing. So I went down that road, but also I had to start pulling back and not doing what I'd always done. And that was a huge thing for me, right? It's like, I guess you could also speak to that. You were in the military. That was who you were. That's how you defined yourself. That's how you saw yourself, how everybody else saw you. And then suddenly you're not in the military. And now what? Now, who am I, right? So we got that kind of going on. But I think my point is what, and I want to get your take on this, was that the trauma that I ended up doing to myself, which ultimately triggered my depression, that in itself was one problem, but it made the things that I was running away from my childhood even worse. It amplified everything, right? And so when we're talking about PTSD and your struggles with PTSD, did you find that too? Is that the PTSD for you, I'm guessing, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, likely happened in your military career. But from the sounds of it, you also had a lot of stuff to deal with coming up as a child, and getting to that point where you did have PTSD, whatever happened in your childhood really amplified itself and became even more intense and maybe, something that you never noticed before, but suddenly was there more than it had ever been previously.
We were yes. And everything that you just said, it just seems like, a lot of feelings and emotions, some of it almost identical. Going back to the prior, the late 70s, early 80s, graduated high school in 82. We were a family that swept everything under the rug. So we didn't talk about it. Men, I'm grateful. I had I feel a pretty good upbringing, but when there were issues or there was some dark stuff, we never talked about it. And the men coming from steelworkers and farmers, we weren't made to share emotions and feelings. And, you didn't want to be seen crying. So add alcohol, when I went to college and then right into the military, they turn you into a tough guy and kind of take away some of the worry. I didn't realize until, 25 years later that I was suppressing all that, and then combine it with the military. Obviously not being an expert, but I do feel I had the input on the PTSD and brain injury stuff. Here's what happened to me. So I retire in 2008, PTSD, anxiety. They just didn't know what to do with me. And I also got very resentful and a lot of anger towards the system, because it's like, look, you guys haven't been looking at this. I granted Vietnam era veterans were my heroes growing up, a lot of my mentors when I first joined the Army, but it's like, you haven't, I get it. They didn't have, good care when they came back, but it's like, okay, so we're 40, 50 years, you still don't have a handle on this. So the transition from the Army into the, the healthcare system of the VA and even civilian, they just looked at me scratching their head, it felt like. So we started down some paths on the substance abuse and the, getting medicine straight and the PTSD. And I was living in a one apartment. I retired from Fort Campbell, Kentucky, went to Nashville because that's where the biggest VA was. And I had nothing in this apartment. Sometimes I just would travel in my truck and live out of it, but I couldn't stay organized. I couldn't, and people always said I was good at planning and organization. And I said, there's something else going on here. Well, on my out processing, I didn't even mention, hey, by the way, I fell on the ground a lot coming out of an airplane parachuting, and I was an explosive breacher. That was one of my primary jobs. So there was definitely some brain injury stuff going on, and I completely forgot about it. That's how sick I was at the time. And, they just didn't So I could see the difference even as sick and as in a dark place I was. There's something different from the textbook symptoms of PTSD. So, and of course, I spent another 3 years just traveling around the country aimlessly and finally got back up to this area where I grew up. It just was what I will say is some of the stuff that every morning I got up, a reckless, kind of outlawish idea, I call it the good idea fairy, would be on my shoulder. And it's like, hey, let's go do this today. This sounds fun, you know, and that was just, and that's just one of, like I say, the brain injury side, not necessarily the PTSD side. Um, Somehow we got a kind of got off the substance, that was, especially the alcohol. That was a big thing for me. Got some medications, I guess, evened out. So, 5 or 6 years ago, that's when I could truly, or the doctors could truly take a look inside. I could start to look inside at the raw bag of shit. And then, what I was truly, actually, I was emotionless. I would sit with this therapist in Baltimore at that program, and she would just pound me because she goes, you're faking it. I'm just sitting there going, she goes, talk about something horrible. And it would be the same face, the same reaction. Talk about something that makes you happy. Of course, I thought, or I acted like nothing made me happy. And my look and my demeanor was truly the same. So I had no idea of how to feel. And of course, you'd sit around in groups and say, well, tell me how you feel and explain that. And I'd be ready to choke someone. It just continued to get better. At that point, I had gotten past the suicidal thoughts, and I was like, yes, we're going to do this no matter what it takes. And just tell me what I need to do. And it was, I kind of got a little frustrated at times when either the medical system or, a veteran, or even I meet more people, police and people outside of any of that now that talk about this stuff. And someone is not seeing it for what it is or what it seems like. Again, me not being a professional, but it's like, you probably have some TBI and some PTSD, definitely depression going on, and they're just not seeing it. So
yeah, that's interesting, right? I mean, that sense of just, it's kind of like a flat affect, I think is the way to describe it, right? It's like nothing makes you excited anymore. You don't get, it's just weird. It's like an unemotional state, as you described. Yet, and that's what I found, was that so quickly, though, to fly off the handle for like the most ridiculous, stupid stuff, right? Like trying to keep anger under control was my biggest thing, was that I wouldn't feel anything, but if something got in my way or pissed me off, even if it was so minuscule, I would just turn into like this crazy person. Like I would just get really upset so quickly.
absolutely. Road rage, the relationship, I had gotten remarried in 2013. The relationship with her, she became a verbal punching bag. We are still together and stronger for it. She had never seen any of the military side before, during it, after. Never had seen any of the traumatic stuff. Never dealt with anything like this. And we are still together today. It's something that we decided to stay together and work together on. But yeah, I would just sit and rant, and just sometimes completely meaningless. And but I was like, and then sitting down with the expert, either on a weekly session or sometimes after, they're like, well, you've listed things and you really don't have anything to be angry about. And then I learned, of course, about misplaced anger. For me, it was just all the stuff that I hadn't worked on over the years, that I had just kept pressing down inside of me. And the more that we pulled that out, it seems like with each year, I usually use the calendar year as a benchmark, but it seems like I just have more of an inner and outward peace with each winter season, which, textbook PTSD, that's when I was mostly deployed. That's usually when, from November to throughout the spring, especially the last 3 tours in Iraq, that brought a lot of, emotion, mental anguish, and some trauma too. So it's kind of reversed. And now, during the fall, from Thanksgiving to Christmas through the new year, I just seem, after the new year, it's like, just, wow, what happened? What am I doing? Just more inner peace.
So if I hear you correctly, there's a couple of things here that I think are useful. One, what you are suggesting is it's important to talk about it. And I think you noted that, right? You need to find somebody that you can trust, that you can talk openly to. So you need to be honest. The second part of that is a position of acceptance. You need to accept that there is a problem. And I think that's in itself is really difficult because people like us, you know, we these go-getters, we get shit done kind of mindset, right? Like you said, running through those walls. It's really difficult to acknowledge that we are struggling. You know, and I guess, and I'm interested to hear that again about that idea of shame, because for me, the shame part that I realized was I was telling everybody else what they needed to do, and I knew what they needed to do, and I knew that if they did that, they would see success. But behind the curtains, I was really struggling doing that myself. And in a way, I kind of felt fake. I felt like I was a failure, right? Like, how can you be giving people advice and telling them what they need to do, but you can't actually do it yourself? And it really took time for me to just be honest with myself and be open. And one of the things that I did that really helped me was I started a blog. And I thought, you know what, I'm just going to be open. And I'm just going to tell people what's been going on. It is, you know, that was for me working through my shame, because my attitude was, you know, it can only go two ways here, right? People are going to read this and just think that I'm a hopeless failure and I'm just, you know, I'm a fraud, or they're going to see the humanity and, you know, at least not that I needed that, but at least an understanding that, hey, you know what, if somebody like Rodney can struggle, and he's working to overcome it, then there's some hope for me. And that's kind of why I started writing the blog. And I was actually quite pleasantly surprised that in sharing my journey and sharing the things that I'd been going through, most people were really supportive.
Absolutely. From 2016 on, the first time that I shared it in a group setting, yes, inside the VA, mostly veterans, but it was so healing for me. And then people coming up afterwards, and it just went from there. For me, the 1 January, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I just felt this, you know, during December, over Christmas, I just continued to feel better. I was working hard and I wasn't just checking all the blocks. I was truly getting rid of some of the darkness. And I woke up and I was still a healthy skeptic about Facebook and social media, but I woke up on January 1st and I just wrote a couple things, out to whoever, friends on Facebook. And by the end of the day, I probably had 70 people, mostly veterans, mostly still deployed around the world saying, dude, man, that I'm experiencing the same thing, but I can't quit. I can't tell anyone about it. I've stayed on the informal side, going back to the brick wall. I think it sounds like an excuse, but I think it, you know, from the military side, during the Gulf War, switched over to SF. I was always, I guess, I don't even know if it was reality, but I was afraid of being captured. You can never surrender. Or if you're in a fight, you can never surrender. That would come up mentally and emotionally sometimes on the lack of acceptance side that, damn it, I'm an airborne ranger, Green Beret. I cannot surrender. Well, probably with the alcohol the most, in 2013, I got, what I heard in a meeting, the gift of desperation. I had no other, my body was going to physically shut down due to alcohol, or I was going to kill myself. So, with that, but then it got hard again 2 years later. Then I was like, oh, I still got a whole bunch. Now I got to really sit down and do the hard internal work. And, I just kept at it. But yes, seeing it for yourself and realizing that, I guess, at that program in 16, that it wasn't a weakness. I was introduced to Brene Brown on the shame side, and on the vulnerability side. And I just dug into her books. I was made to read them at first. And then it's like, oh, this is good stuff. And then I found out she was working with the military and, tons of people experiencing this. And that's when I got an appreciation and an empathy for everyone. And I started having people come up. They're like, wow, I heard that. I've experienced it, but it's nothing. I kind of didn't like when people said it's nothing like you've experienced in the military. I said, well, I don't think it takes that much saturation. It doesn't take that much repetition. You never had any training. So one small short event, could be enough for you to make everything just as bad as me. And the shame, man, that was, like I said, the textbook definition explained to me is, guilty, you made a mistake. If you carry it, you're still a good person. Just try not to. Shame, again, it had been like I'd never heard the definition is, you did something wrong, whether you meant to or not, but you carry it as if you're a bad person. And I truly thought, civilian, military, personal, family, friends, that I had become a bad, evil person. And I can't even express what that humbling, horrible, what that felt like the first time that I looked in the mirror. And then even a couple years after 2016, truly feeling better, I still couldn't look at myself in the mirror. There was still something going on. I still wasn't okay with the guy in the mirror. It didn't so much have to do with shame at that point. It just, some of the little, issues, or, what 12-step call character defects. I was still trying to be the perfectionist. I was still trying to, over control and manage the situation, manage the outcomes. And so then I went back to work on that stuff with the therapist, and, fully realized at that point about 2 years ago, it's the process, trust the process. It's probably going to be never ending, and just embrace it.
So what I'm also interested in is one of the things we said we would also talk about, and this I find very, very interesting too, because I've had some experience with this, is how nutrition actually aids in, mental and emotional clarity. So maybe speak to us about that and why that became so important for you.
Oh, brother, funny story. So I'm sitting with my therapist outside the VA, and we connected. She was at a veteran event, and she put up a slideshow. And I wasn't seeing anyone outside the VA. I was just checking the blocks at the time, and my wife starts elbowing me. We were there together, and she's like, she gets it. I think you need to go see her now. So I started seeing her. We're making huge progress. She could just, one of those people that could see through me. And even I wasn't even trying to hide anything. She goes, hey, we just got this nutritionist in. And, I was still having some anger and some irritability. And she goes, why don't you go see her? I'm like, yeah, let's go do it. Well, this lady was just, great, smart, but it was overwhelming. And here's me, I get my committee in my head, and it's like, man, I'm working so hard, but now I got to eat better. And we had just gone, my wife and I had just done a 12-week, the Amazing 12. I think that guy's over in the UK or Ireland or Scotland somewhere. And so, which was a big part of eating right. And I'm like, wow, I just did this. I'm going to embrace it, but I'm only going to do it my way. Well, so I took the blood test. It's all about inflammation, and, not necessarily something you're allergic to, but the intolerances. And I didn't get that at first. I kept using my opinion or my version, the perfectionist, over controlling guy. But I kept at it, and slowly but surely I saw a difference, and it was huge. And, I would nip away at the perfection. I would nip away, well, cheat day here. And I'm so much better, and it has helped so much. I wish I could, I say to veterans, anyone really, but especially to veterans, I wish I could wrap this up in a pill, or in a box or a formula recipe and give it to you, but I can't. But I said, it's made such a difference for me. And how powerful is that to know throughout the day or throughout the week what you can put in your body to take away the sleepiness, to give you a little energy, how to regulate that, how far you can go on, if for whatever reason, you miss a meal, how important water is. It's been huge. Probably 2 years into it when I first started to see the mental and emotional. And that probably has to do something with, the yearly easing of the mind. It's just, it's so rewarding, but it's been tough. It really has.
So can you give us some specific things? Like, what did you actually change in your diet? What were some of the things that you changed that ultimately led to you finding some success in doing that?
We call ourselves cavemen. So basically everything I made fun of, in the locker room or the team room as a caveman, gluten-free, dairy-free, sometimes I'm vegan, on and on and on. If I fought, what were my intolerances? It was corn and something else I like right off the bat from the blood test. And it's like, well, and the program at first with the nutritionist was just to, kind of cut those out. And then if you really like them, bring them back in slowly. And of course, I'm going to be all or none. Over time though, dairy, somehow 21 years in the military and then still, running hard other things outside for, almost 28 years, really no physical injuries except for internal stuff. And one of them was the acid reflux. And the last 3-4 years, this little, like frog in my throat, that comes from dairy for me. And now if I eat something that has that in there, that will be a physical effect. It really doesn't, take away fatigue or, mental, acuity, anything else like that. But it's just, I know I'm going to get that, but it's so much more, it's short duration. It won't even last through going to bed and definitely won't wake up with it. It was a high starch, carbohydrate guy. Grew up in the upper Ohio Valley of West Virginia, Pittsburgh, and Ohio, eating a ton of Italian food, and I still love it. Pizza's still my favorite, but I can see what that does, especially during the day, like midday, to my body and my mind. So, I stay away from that. Definitely gluten-free bread. And people ask me about it all the time. I wish I could get better at explaining it. I say, I really still don't understand, but processed wheat. Gluten-free, dairy-free, a little bit of cheese, maybe on a salad, natural, anything natural, supplement-wise, natural. I've even gone through, the nutritionist even made me go through all my meds mostly with the VA and look at all the components inside there that could still be causing an intolerance. And again, like in the last 2 years with the physical side, but with the mental and emotional, I wish I had this much awareness and I guess self-resilience back, 25 years ago. I don't feel like I felt like this.
Yeah, so that's really interesting. So one of the things that I've done over the last several months is I've definitely done the same thing. I've cleaned up my diet. Now mostly vegetarian, as you were saying as well, taking out gluten. And the reason I did that is because my partner has a real problem with gluten. So, being in a household together, trying to have 2 different meals, this doesn't make sense. I've just it's easier if I just go the way that she's going. So I've ended up cutting out gluten and everything else. And I feel so much better myself. And it definitely interacts with your mood. That's for sure, right? So if you're eating unhealthily and you're not eating food that's good for you, it's going to mess with your mood. And we know that actually, which is interestingly, and there's a lot of scientific evidence coming out right now about your gut and how your gut is connected to your mental state. And so if your gut is out and, all the natural biome that you have in your gut, if that's not 100% right, that's going to affect your mental state. So that is something that we know. And I don't have all of it in front of me, but it's quite easy to find that on the internet and people can go out and have a look at that. But that's fascinating to me. And, as I've started cutting things out, the one thing that I found that was an issue for me was cheese, right? Dairy as well. So cheese is I love it, but it's absolutely no for me. And one of the things that I also noticed was when I was really depressed, one of the things that I was struggling with all the time was a lot of gut problems, right? I was just really feeling like my stomach was sore all the time, and aches and pains in my abdomen. It was there all the time. It was constant. And so getting my diet right is obviously what it's done is it's restarted or kickstarted the natural processes in my stomach. It's kind of got everything to where it is. The kind of the probiotics that I take as well also help. And massive effect on mood. And I think a lot of people just don't realize that, right? I think one of the things that maybe is a takeaway in what we're talking about is it's not just you just don't just do one thing and then things are fixed, right? So if we look at what we've been discussing up until this point, we're saying, okay, speak to somebody that you really trust. That's really important. Take ownership for what's really going on and be honest with yourself. Change your diet. Look at what you're eating. Change your diet. And I like what you were saying, which is really important, right? So we take all these things out and we can slowly put them back in, but you're only going to know if it's a problem for you when you do it that way. But definitely by changing your diet, you change your mood, which is, most people don't think that. I think they don't realize how important it is what you consume affects how you feel and ultimately how you think.
Yes, spot on. That's actually what Jessica, the nutritionist, started out with. And I thought, well, this makes sense. And I didn't look at it. I just did what I was told. But then she kept giving me more literature and stuff on the internet to look at. And I'm like, well, this makes total sense. And I really, whenever I started with her, I really dug into it. And so, you try to give a shade tree version to someone you meet in training or, friends or family, and, give an easy definition. And they just kind of, well, yeah, that makes sense. I'm like, well, it's both simple, but it's not necessarily easy to employ. But if you're feeling this way, or if not feeling about the way you look, I said, we're not trying to be beach models anymore. It's about longevity. If you can't bend over to tie your shoes, but very few people implement it because it's just, I found out about stress eating and comfort foods. Stress eating, are the crunchy, and I want to do chips. And she looked at me one day and said, well, why can't you do crunchy vegetables? I'm like, well, I don't want to. Yes, I do, but that was hard. Why can't I do crunchy peanut M&Ms? So, and then of course I explored the comfort food or the stress eating. And, the more I made myself learn and pushed myself, that is probably, other than reaching deep down and getting in touch with that internal, 800-pound gorilla, it was this, what I don't truly know if it's stress eating or comfort eating, but this has, been the recent hurdle, has been stuff like that. And it's small comparison to what it was 3 years ago. So, but I'm like, why do I keep going back to this? It's a process.
Yeah, I think it is. So just coming to the final point, which I think kind of just brings everything home, is that this idea of longevity, right? Is that we forget that at some point we're going to age. And as you've kind of hinted to, we're not going to be able to do the things we used to do. And I think everything we're speaking about just, fixing diet, being honest with ourselves, dealing with the problems in a productive way, really comes down to this idea of longevity, because that's one of the things that stood in my mind when I was going through all of this stuff. And one of the reasons, outside of for my children, of course, because I have 2 boys, but also for myself, I was like, wow, you know what? If I'm going to be around for the next 20, 30 years, or however long I'm going to be on this planet, I don't want to be in the same place I'm in right now, 20 years from now.
Yeah, right. And I still want to be active. But yes, that's, so I try not to, live too much, try to predict and manage that outcome. But I want to be active. And if nothing else, if I can't train, if I can't work out myself, at least run around with the kids and the grandkids, especially the grandkids, because, and to accept that and to be able to visualize and prepare for it. It's just, it has made me feel better. And then when you're able to help someone else, because our one daughter, who was a triathlete and a marathon runner, and now has gone through this both up and down with 2, she's pregnant again, but she's had the one granddaughter, which will be 5, and she talks about everything. She has really helped me, and to see her go through it, depression, eating and not throwing up, doing stuff, that has helped me, because it was like, well, if I just do it, but seeing someone else go through it and talk about it and share it, and she made herself vulnerable. And then she's also a lot more of an expert on do's and don'ts. And I'm like, and she's patient, thank goodness, to sit down and be able to help me. And then people ask, what are you doing this for? Are you going to go back to, I never did any contracting, military contracting. They're like, what are you doing this for? I'm like, longevity and personal well-being and be able to help others,
So JD, I mean, where are you now? Like and we're talking about professionally, what are you actually doing right now? Like where do you see yourself?
My wife and I have a small training business, OSS2 shooting and survival. I teach local classes or regional classes, and myself and two other retired SF guys who are medics. So they would prefer to shoot, but we try to also, look at everything that we've talked about, especially on the non-physical side, and put that into our training. I've also been involved with training with a nonprofit that deals in human trafficking and child slavery, mostly overseas, but they're doing more work domestically, and that's volunteer. But it's really, I say part-time. If you look at a schedule, which sometimes, is in my head, it really looks full-time. But I said our youngest son is a junior in high school. He's big in basketball, and I just can't tell him, no, son, I can't be there. So I still say what I do is more part-time, and I'm still partially retired. But if there is someone, especially on the law enforcement side, really, I guess I could have summed it up. Any transfer of my skill set or what I've learned that we've talked about in the last 12 years to anyone, military, law enforcement, civilian, that's what I'd like to do. If it happens to be with our small business, independent contracting, that is what I'm passionate about. But it can be as simple as sitting down with someone, having this conversation over coffee in the morning.
No, that's fantastic. So as we come to the end, JD, leave us with some words of wisdom. What would you want to leave us with? Your parting thoughts, something that will just get people, thinking about something that they should do in their own lives and hopefully change for the better.
Here's a controversial one for you. I always loved, I don't know if I was really a Nike guy, but, controversial because some of the latest current events with advertising, marketing, and political stuff, but it can be just as simple as just do it. Okay. If you are able to look at yourself in the mirror and identify that stuff, okay. Yeah. Most veterans say, well, embrace the suck. Well, for me, the mental and emotional side, it truly sucked. And I didn't really want to be outward about it. But now it can be as simple as just freaking do it. Just do it. You've got some facts, you've got some literature, you've got someone else that has experienced it. Just do it and get it done.
To learn more about the art of self-reliance, our virtual coaching service, online courses, and our retreats in Thailand, head over to Primal Skills. That's with a Z.com.